The lecture hall fell silent except for the sound of trembling fingers hovering over ivory keys. Maya Williams stood frozen at the grand piano, 30 pairs of eyes boring into her back like laser beams. Professor Richard Thornfield's voice cut through the air like a blade. "This little girl thinks she can play Chopin? What a delightful joke!" His words dripped with condescension as scattered laughter rippled through the room. Maya bit her lower lip hard enough to taste copper. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Thornfield began a slow, mocking clap. "Please, Miss Williams, show us your special talent." The applause echoed hollow in the grand space, each clap a slap to her dignity. The room held its breath. 30 seconds that would change everything. Have you ever had someone dismiss your dreams before they even gave you a chance? What happened next would turn this moment of humiliation into something nobody saw coming. 3 hours earlier, Maya had woken to the sound of her grandmother's alarm clock rattling on the nightstand they shared. The cramped studio apartment in South End smelled of instant coffee and the lavender soap her grandmother used to mask the persistent dampness that crept through the walls each winter. Maya rolled off the pull-out couch that doubled as her bed, careful not to wake Grandma Rose, who was already stirring in the tiny alcove that served as their bedroom. Sunlight filtered through the single window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny stars above their second-hand furniture. "Morning, baby girl," Rose whispered, her voice rough from another late shift at the textile factory. Her weathered hands reached for the uniform hanging on the back of their only chair. "You got that big class today?" Maya nodded, pulling on the same navy sweater she'd worn 3 times this week. The wool had thinned at the elbows, but it was clean and it was warm. Her fingers traced the small hole near the left pocket that she'd tried to mend with matching thread. The routine never changed. Maya would grab her backpack, kiss her grandmother's cheek, and walk 43 minutes to the prestigious Berklee Academy of Music. Other students arrived in cars their parents bought them for their 16th birthdays. Maya arrived with blisters on her feet and determination in her heart. She worked 25 hours a week at Brew and Bean, a coffee shop 3 blocks from campus. The smell of espresso had permanently embedded itself in her clothes, mixing with the scent of the vanilla body spray she'd bought at the dollar store. Tips were good when she smiled bright enough. Tips were everything when your partial scholarship only covered 60% of tuition. The weight of her student loans felt heavier each semester, $17,000 and counting. Her grandmother's Social Security check barely covered their rent, leaving Maya to juggle textbooks, groceries, and the constant fear that one bad grade might cost her everything. But every morning, as she walked past the limestone facade of Berklee Academy, something inside her chest expanded like a balloon filling with helium. The building stood like a cathedral to music, its tall windows promising that dreams could become reality if you worked hard enough, if you wanted it badly enough. Maya had discovered piano at 12, hunched over a computer in the public library, watching YouTube videos of concert pianists whose fingers moved like water over keys. She'd pause and replay each passage, memorizing finger positions she couldn't practice until Sundays at Mount Olive Baptist Church. Pastor Williams had noticed her lingering after service, staring at the old upright piano that wheezed when certain keys were pressed. "You want to try?" he'd asked one afternoon. Maya's nod had been shy but eager. That piano became her sanctuary. Every Sunday after service, every Wednesday during prayer meetings, every Saturday when the church was empty except for the cleaning crew. She taught herself Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata by watching free online tutorials and playing the melody on a paper keyboard she'd drawn herself. Grandma Rose would find her practicing finger exercises on the kitchen table, tapping out rhythms on the formica surface. "Child, you gonna wear holes in that table," she'd say. But her eyes held pride. "Maybe someday you'll play for real people, not just for God and me." Maya's acceptance letter to Berklee had arrived on a Tuesday. She'd stared at it for 10 minutes, afraid that reading it might make the words disappear. When she finally opened it, her hands shook so hard she could barely hold the paper. Partial scholarship. Need-based aid. Work-study program. It wasn't a full ride, but it was a chance. Her high school guidance counselor had tried to temper her expectations. Maya, be realistic. These conservatory programs are competitive. Maybe consider community college first. Build some credentials. But Maya had learned long ago that realistic meant settling for less than what her heart demanded. She'd grown up watching her grandmother work double shifts, watching dreams get deferred until they disappeared entirely. Maya refused to let her music become another casualty of circumstance. The other students at Berkeley carried instrument cases that cost more than Maya's annual income. They spoke casually about summer programs in Vienna and private lessons with former members of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. They wore confidence like expensive perfume, invisible but unmistakable. Maya carried her sheet music in a folder held together with duct tape. She practiced on the community piano in the dormitory lobby when no one else was around, usually after midnight when her fingers were stiff from serving coffee all day. But when she played, really played, the difference between formal training and pure passion became irrelevant. Music didn't care about the designer labels sewn into her classmates' clothes. Music didn't ask for transcripts or letters of recommendation. Music only asked for truth. Still, doubt crept in during moments like these, walking into Professor Thornfield's advanced performance analysis class. The master class was optional, but attendance looked good on academic records. Maya needed every advantage she could gather. She slipped into the back row, hoping to observe without being noticed. Her worn notebook was already filled with observations about phrasing, dynamics, and interpretation techniques she'd heard other students discuss. If she couldn't afford private lessons, she could at least absorb knowledge from the air around her. The stakes were simple, but brutal. Her scholarship required maintaining a 3.7 GPA. One failed class, one semester of mediocre grades, and she'd be back in South End permanently, watching her dreams shrink to the size of their studio apartment. Maya opened her notebook and prepared to listen, to learn, to survive another day in a world that wasn't built for girls like her. She had no idea that in less than an hour, surviving would become the least of her concerns. Professor Richard Thornfield entered the lecture hall like a man accustomed to reverence. His leather briefcase clicked against the marble floor with each measured step, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling designed to amplify every note played within these walls. At 55, Thornfield carried himself with the bearing of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His silver hair was precisely combed, his navy blazer pressed to perfection. The Rolex on his wrist caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows as he arranged his papers on the mahogany podium. 25 years of teaching at Berkeley had earned him a corner office lined with accolades. Diplomas from Juilliard and the Royal Academy of Music hung in gilded frames. Photographs showed him shaking hands with conductors whose names graced concert halls around the world. A signed poster from his Carnegie Hall debut in 1995 dominated the wall behind his desk. His students feared him and revered him in equal measure. One word from Professor Thornfield could launch a career or end it before it began. His recommendation letters opened doors that remained locked to others. His criticism, delivered with surgical precision, could reduce promising musicians to tears. Thornfield surveyed the lecture hall with the slow, deliberate gaze of a general inspecting troops. 30 students sat in ascending rows, each hoping to catch his attention for the right reasons. He removed his reading glasses from their leather case, perching them on his nose as he studied the faces before him. Today, we examine Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, he began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent in front of classrooms like this one. A piece that separates mere piano players from true musicians. His eyes lingered on certain students as he spoke. Catherine Morrison, whose father had donated the new grand piano in the recital hall. James Wellington, third-generation Berkeley alumni whose trust fund ensured he'd never worry about tuition. These were his people. These were the students who understood that classical music was about heritage, about tradition, about maintaining standards. Thornfield believed, though he would never say it aloud, that certain types of music belonged to certain types of people. Jazz could be taught to anyone with rhythm. Pop music required only basic chord progressions. But classical music, real classical music, demanded something deeper. It required breeding, education, the kind of cultural foundation that couldn't be learned from YouTube videos or community center piano lessons. He'd grown up in Connecticut, the son of a federal judge and a symphony violinist. Piano lessons had begun at age 4. By 16, he was performing with youth orchestras. College at Juilliard had felt inevitable, natural, the logical progression of a life built around excellence. When he looked at his current students, he could immediately identify those who belonged and those who were, frankly, academic tourists. The scholarship students usually revealed themselves within the first week. They tried too hard, asked too many questions, carried themselves with the desperate hunger of people who knew they didn't quite fit. Thornfield's teaching philosophy was simple. Pressure revealed character. The students who belonged would rise to meet his expectations. Those who didn't would find other majors, other schools, other dreams more suited to their circumstances. He gestured toward the Steinway grand piano that dominated the front of the classroom. Chopin wrote this ballad in 1835 during his relationship with George Sand. It requires not just technical precision, but emotional sophistication, the ability to convey narrative through music. His gaze swept across the room again, pausing momentarily on Maya in the back row. She was taking notes furiously, her pen moving across the page with intensity that bordered on desperation. He'd noticed her in previous classes. Scholarship student, obviously, the kind who recorded lectures on her phone because she couldn't afford the supplementary materials. The first movement demands an understanding of romantic nationalism that extends beyond mere fingerwork, Thornfield continued. It requires cultural literacy, historical context, the kind of deep musical education that cannot be improvised. The word improvised carried weight, delivered with just enough emphasis to make several students glance around nervously. Catherine and James exchanged knowing looks. They'd heard Professor Thornfield's opinions about the changing demographics of classical music education, how standards were being lowered to accommodate students who lacked proper foundation, how diversity initiatives sometimes prioritized demographics over ability. Thornfield never said these things directly, of course. He was too sophisticated for crude prejudice. Instead, he spoke in code about traditional excellence and maintaining standards and cultural authenticity. His discrimination wore the mask of academic rigor. As he prepared to begin the day's analysis, his attention was drawn to Maya's concentrated note-taking. Something about her intense focus irritated him. The presumption that she could absorb in one semester what his other students had been breathing since childhood. "Before we begin," he said, his voice taking on a tone that made several students straighten in their seats, "perhaps we should ensure everyone here truly understands what we're discussing." His eyes found Maya again, and this time they stayed there. "Miss Williams, isn't it? I believe you've been quite attentive in our previous sessions." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that everyone in the room could feel but couldn't quite define. Maya looked up from her notebook, her pen still poised above the page. "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. Thornfield smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. "Wonderful. Then perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your understanding of what we've been studying." The master class had drawn more than the usual crowd. Parents sat in the back rows, their expensive handbags and tailored coats marking them as the kind of people who wrote donation checks to keep programs like this running. 3 other faculty members had slipped in quietly, notebooks balanced on their laps as they observed Thornfield's legendary teaching methods. Maya felt the weight of all those eyes, even though none were focused on her. She'd chosen the back corner deliberately, hoping to blend into the shadows cast by the tiered seating. Her pen moved steadily across the page as Thornfield began his analysis of Chopin's harmonic progressions. Note the sophisticated use of chromaticism in measures 12 through 16, Thornfield said, his pointer tapping against the projected score. Chopin weaves dissonance and resolution in ways that require both technical mastery and interpretive maturity. Maya's hand was cramped from taking notes, but she didn't dare slow down. Every word felt precious, a piece of knowledge she couldn't afford to lose. Around her, other students nodded along as if these concepts were as familiar as breathing. The rubato in this passage, Thornfield continued, demands an understanding of romantic expression that goes beyond mere mechanical precision. It requires cultural fluency, the kind of deep musical literacy that... He paused, his gaze scanning the room until it found Maya's bent head. Miss Williams. Her pen froze mid-sentence. The sudden silence in the lecture hall felt thick enough to cut. I notice you're taking quite extensive notes. His voice carried a tone that made several students turn to look at her. Perhaps you'd like to share your insights on this passage? Maya's throat felt like sandpaper. I'm just trying to follow along, Professor. Oh, I'm sure you are. Thornfield set down his pointer and walked closer to her section of seats. But I'm curious about your perspective, given your rather unique background. The emphasis on unique made Catherine Morrison smirk. 2 rows down, James Wellington whispered something to his neighbor that made them both suppress laughs. I understand you've been quite diligent in your studies, Thornfield continued, now standing directly below Maya's seat. Self-taught, if I'm not mistaken. Heat rushed to Maya's face. Yes, sir, partially. Fascinating. He clasped his hands behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels. And where exactly did you acquire your musical education? YouTube University? A ripple of laughter spread through the room like a slow wave. Maya felt her chest tighten. I practiced at my church, sir. And I've been working through the required texts. Your church? Thornfield's eyebrows raised in mock surprise. How quaint. And you feel this preparation has adequately equipped you to understand the nuances of Chopin's compositional genius? The question hung in the air like a blade. Maya could feel 30 pairs of eyes boring into her, waiting for her response. In the back row, one of the visiting parents leaned forward with obvious interest. I try my best to learn, Professor. Oh, I'm certain you do. Thornfield's smile never reached his eyes. But effort and ability are quite different things, wouldn't you agree? Tell me, Miss Williams, have you ever actually performed Chopin? In front of an audience? Maya's hands were trembling now. No, sir. Not in a formal setting. Not in a formal setting. He repeated her words slowly, as if tasting them. But surely someone with such dedication. Would you have some familiarity with the repertoire we're discussing? The trap was closing around her, and Maya could sense it. Every word felt like stepping onto thin ice that might crack beneath her weight. I've studied some of his pieces on my own. Studied? Thornfield turned to address the entire class now, his voice projecting to the back rows where the parents sat. Class, Miss Williams has studied Chopin. Perhaps she'd be willing to demonstrate this study for us? Maya's stomach dropped. Professor, I don't think... Nonsense. He gestured grandly toward the Steinway at the front of the room. You've been so attentive to our discussion of Ballade No. 1, surely you'd welcome the opportunity to show us your interpretation. The silence that followed was deafening. Maya could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Catherine whispered something to James that made him cover his mouth to hide his grin. Come now, Miss Williams. Thornfield's voice carried false encouragement. Don't be modest. This is a learning environment. We're all here to support each other's growth. But his eyes told a different story. They held the cold satisfaction of a predator who had cornered its prey. I'm sure everyone would be very... He paused, letting the word hang. Interested in your unique approach to classical interpretation. Maya felt the walls closing in. Every face in the room was turned toward her now, waiting. The visiting parents looked curious. The faculty members had stopped taking notes. Her fellow students wore expressions ranging from pity to barely concealed amusement. "Do you dare, Miss Williams?" Thornfield asked softly. "And if you dare, can you actually pull it off?" The challenge lay between them like a gauntlet thrown at her feet. Maya knew with crystal clarity that whatever happened next would define not just this moment, but everything that came after. Time stretched like taffy in the suffocating silence. Maya's mind raced through a kaleidoscope of memories, each one pulling her in a different direction. She saw herself at 12, fingers dancing across the paper keyboard she'd drawn with careful precision on cardboard, imagining the weight of real keys beneath her touch. She remembered the first time Pastor Williams had let her try the church piano, how the sound had filled the empty sanctuary like prayer, made audible. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, strong and unwavering. "Baby girl, don't you ever let anybody make you feel small. You got music in your soul that doesn't come from fancy schools. That comes from God." Maya thought about all those Sunday afternoons, all those Wednesday nights, all those stolen Saturday mornings when she'd crept into the church before anyone else arrived. Hours upon hours of teaching herself what others learned in climate-controlled practice rooms with private instructors. She thought about the $17,000 in loans, the 25 hours a week serving coffee to pay for the privilege of sitting in rooms like this one. She thought about her grandmother's calloused hands, and the way Rose fell asleep in her chair after 12-hour shifts, still wearing her factory uniform. This moment wasn't just about her. It was about every kid who'd ever been told their dreams were too big for their circumstances, every person who'd been judged by their zip code instead of their heart. The choice crystallized in front of her like ice forming on a window. She could apologize, make excuses, shrink back into the safety of invisibility. She could preserve what little dignity she had left and avoid the public humiliation that surely awaited her at that piano. Or she could stand up. Maya's hands stopped trembling. Something shifted in her chest, a quiet strength that rose from deep inside like water from an underground spring. She thought about all the times she'd played alone, pouring her fears and hopes into melodies that only the church walls had heard. Music didn't care about her worn sneakers or her second-hand sweater. Music didn't ask for her transcript or her bank statement. Music only cared about truth. She looked up and met Thornfield's expectant gaze. His smug confidence was obvious to everyone in the room. He'd backed her into a corner, forced her into an impossible situation where failure was the only expected outcome. Maya rose slowly from her seat. Her legs felt steady beneath her, steadier than they had any right to feel. She lifted her chin and squared her shoulders, finding something in her posture that felt like armor. "I'll play, Professor." The words came out clear and strong, surprising even herself. Around the room, she could feel the shift in attention, the sudden acute focus of 30 people who hadn't expected this response. Thornfield's eyebrows raised slightly, but his smile remained predatory. "Excellent. How brave of you." Maya began walking down the tiered steps toward the piano, her worn sneakers silent on the carpeted stairs. With each step, she left a piece of her old self behind. "I may not have studied at Juilliard," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the lecture hall, "but I know Chopin." The Steinway grand piano sat in the center of the lecture hall like a sleeping giant, its ebony surface reflecting the afternoon light that streamed through the tall windows. Maya approached it with the reverence of someone entering a cathedral, her footsteps echoing in the hushed space. 30 pairs of eyes followed her movement. The visiting parents leaned forward in their seats. Faculty members held their pens suspended above their notebooks. Even Catherine and James had stopped whispering, caught up in the electric tension that filled the room. Maya pulled out the piano bench and adjusted its height, her movements deliberate and careful. She'd dreamed of moments like this, sitting before a concert grand piano, but never under circumstances like these. The bench was perfectly cushioned, a luxury compared to the hard wooden seat at Mount Olive Baptist Church. She placed her hands on her lap and closed her eyes for a moment, centering herself the way she'd learned to do during those solitary practice sessions. In her mind, she could hear Pastor Williams' voice. "Child, when you sit at these keys, you're not just playing notes. You're telling stories that words can't tell." Thornfield stood to the side, arms crossed, his expression a mixture of anticipation and barely concealed satisfaction. He'd seen this scenario play out before. Overconfident students who thought they could wing their way through pieces that demanded years of proper study. The humiliation would be swift and decisive. Maya opened her eyes and placed her fingers on the keys. The touch was electric, each key responding with a clarity and richness that made the church piano seem like a toy in comparison. For a moment, she simply felt the weight of the keys, the responsiveness of the action, the potential that lay beneath her fingertips. She began. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 emerged tentatively, almost questioning. Her right hand found the simple melody while her left hand provided a gentle accompaniment. But something was wrong. Her fingers felt stiff, unfamiliar with the touch of this magnificent instrument. The notes came out hesitant, lacking the confidence that the piece demanded. A few students exchanged glances. Catherine smirked and nudged James with her elbow. Thornfield's smile grew wider, his vindication beginning already. Maya's heart hammered in her chest. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She'd played this piece hundreds of times in her mind, had worked through every passage during those late-night practice sessions when the church was empty and dark. But this piano was different. The acoustics were different. The pressure was crushing. She stumbled slightly on a passage in the second phrase, her left hand missing the bass note that anchored the harmony. The mistake echoed in the perfect acoustics of the lecture hall, magnified and obvious to every trained ear in the room. "Perhaps," Thornfield said softly, loud enough for the front rows to hear, "we should stop there before—" But Maya didn't stop. She closed her eyes again, this time blocking out everything except the music. In her mind, she wasn't in a lecture hall surrounded by judgment and expectation. She was 12 years old again, discovering Chopin for the first time on a crackling YouTube video. She was 15, playing by candlelight when the electricity had been shut off for 3 days. She was 17, performing for an audience of empty pews and painted saints. The transformation began slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape. Her shoulders relaxed, her breathing deepened. Her fingers began to remember not the foreign feel of this piano, but the familiar language of the music itself. The melody returned, but now it carried weight. The simple opening phrase that had seemed tentative moments before now spoke with quiet confidence. Maya's left hand found its groove, providing the rolling accompaniment that Chopin had woven like a foundation beneath the soaring right-hand melody. Measure by measure, note by note, Maya stopped fighting the piano and started dancing with it. The hesitation disappeared, replaced by an understanding that went deeper than technique. She wasn't just playing the notes on the page. She was telling the story that Chopin had embedded in those notes. The first movement flowed into the second, and Maya's interpretation began to reveal itself. Where other students might have focused on technical perfection, Maya brought something different. She brought lived experience. The yearning in Chopin's melody spoke to her own yearning. The struggle between hope and despair that ran through the piece reflected her own daily battles. Her fingers moved across the keys with increasing confidence. The left hand provided a steady pulse, while the right hand sang with a voice that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than muscle memory. She played the ornaments not as technical exercises, but as emotional expressions, each trill and turn colored with meaning. The room had gone completely silent except for the music. Even Thornfield's smug expression had faded, replaced by something approaching attention. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't the embarrassing failure he'd been anticipating. Maya reached the development section where Chopin had woven the main themes into an intricate tapestry of variations. Her years of self-study showed here, not as weakness, but as strength. She'd learned this music not from an instructor's interpretation, but from the inside out, building her understanding note by note, phrase by phrase. The music grew more complex, and Maya rose to meet it. Her hands moved independently, the left hand providing a foundation of octaves and chords while the right hand spun melodic lines that seemed to float above the harmony. She'd practiced this passage on the church piano until her fingers bled, working through every fingering challenge, every awkward reach. But now, on this magnificent instrument, the technical challenges melted away. The Steinway responded to her touch like a partner in conversation, amplifying every dynamic nuance, every subtle shift in color. What had been difficult on the old upright piano became effortless on this concert grand. The middle section arrived, marked con fuoco, with fire. Maya's interpretation ignited. The passionate, almost desperate energy that Chopin had written into these measures poured out of her like water from a broken dam. This was the section where technique alone wasn't enough. This required a soul. Maya's body swayed slightly with the music, her whole being engaged in the performance. She played with her eyes closed now, trusting her fingers to find their way while her heart guided the interpretation. The music told stories of struggle and triumph, of dreams deferred but not destroyed. Around the room, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Parents who had come expecting a dry academic lecture found themselves leaning forward, caught up in the emotional power of Maya's performance. Faculty members had stopped taking notes entirely, their pens forgotten as they listened. Catherine sat frozen in her seat, her earlier smirk completely gone. James stared at Maya with an expression of disbelief. These were students who had heard hundreds of piano performances, who prided themselves on their sophisticated musical taste. But what they were hearing now was different. Raw, honest, real. The climax approached, the moment where Chopin had poured all his emotional intensity into a cascading passage that demanded everything from the performer. Maya's fingers prepared for the challenge, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. She was thinking about her grandmother, working the night shift so Maya could chase this impossible dream. She was thinking about every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. The climax erupted from the piano like a thunderstorm. Maya's hands flew across the keys, but every note was controlled, purposeful, alive with meaning. The technical demands that might have destroyed a lesser performer became vehicles for her expression. She played through pain and joy, through fear and hope, through every emotion she'd ever been afraid to feel. Time seemed suspended. The world outside the lecture hall ceased to exist. There was only the music, only the story being told through 88 keys and 10 fingers and one heart that refused to be broken. Then, as suddenly as the storm had begun, it was over. The final chord rang out in the perfect acoustics of the lecture hall, hanging in the air like incense. Maya's hands remained on the keys for a moment, her head bowed, her breathing deep and steady. The silence that followed was absolute. For 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5 seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the universe was afraid to break the spell that Maya had woven. Then reality crashed back into the room like a wave breaking against the shore. The silence shattered like glass hitting concrete. Applause erupted from every corner of the lecture hall, not the polite academic clapping that usually followed student performances, but thunderous, overwhelming, genuine applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. People leaped to their feet as if pulled by invisible strings, their hands coming together in a rhythm that sounded like celebration itself. "Incredible!" someone shouted from the back row. One, "Absolutely stunning!" called out another voice. "I've never heard anything like that." The standing ovation built like a tidal wave, starting with the visiting parents and spreading row by row until every person in the lecture hall was on their feet. Faculty members who had attended hundreds of student recitals stood with expressions of genuine amazement. The department chair, who had slipped in during the middle of Maya's performance, clapped with tears streaming down her face. Maya remained seated at the piano bench, her hands still resting on the keys, trying to process what was happening around her. The sound of applause felt surreal, like something happening to someone else in a different room. She turned slowly to face the audience, her eyes wide with disbelief. Catherine Morrison sat frozen in her seat for a moment before slowly, reluctantly, beginning to clap. Her face was flushed red, her earlier smugness completely evaporated. James Wellington beside her looked as if he'd been struck by lightning, his mouth hanging open as he mechanically joined the applause. But it was Thornfield's face that told the real story. The professor stood motionless beside the piano, his arms hanging at his sides like broken wings. His carefully constructed composure had crumbled completely. The smug confidence that had defined his expression for the past hour was gone, replaced by something that looked suspiciously like shock. His face had gone pale except for 2 bright spots of red on his cheeks. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His eyes darted from Maya to the applauding crowd and back again, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was witnessing. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't how the story was supposed to end. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity. Maya slowly stood up from the piano bench, her legs unsteady beneath her. She looked out at the sea of faces, all turned toward her with expressions she'd never seen before. Respect, admiration, recognition. An elderly man in an expensive suit, one of the major donors, Maya realized, was applauding so enthusiastically that his glasses had slipped down his nose. A woman in the 3rd row had pulled out her phone and was recording, tears visible on her cheeks. Finally, gradually, the applause began to subside. People settled back into their seats, but the energy in the room remained electric. Conversations bubbled up immediately, whispered exclamations of amazement and disbelief. Did you hear that phrasing in the development section? The way she handled the technical passages was extraordinary. I've never heard such emotional depth from a student performance. Thornfield cleared his throat, trying to reassemble his professional demeanor. His voice, when it finally came, sounded strained. That was quite exceptional. The word seemed to stick in his throat like a bone. Maya turned to face him fully, her chin raised, her shoulders straight. The trembling girl who had sat in the back row taking desperate notes was gone. In her place stood someone who had just discovered her own power. "Professor," she said, her voice carrying clearly to every corner of the now quiet lecture hall, "music doesn't need a diploma to prove talent. It only needs a heart." The words landed in the silence like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples through the room. Several students nodded emphatically. One of the faculty members actually smiled and wrote something in her notebook. Thornfield's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, embarrassment, and finally, grudging acceptance. He looked at Maya as if seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, not the scholarship student he'd dismissed, but the musician she actually was. "Yes," he said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, I believe you've demonstrated that quite convincingly." From the back of the lecture hall, a new voice spoke up. Dr. Sarah Lane, the Academy's director, stepped forward from where she'd been observing quietly near the entrance. Her face wore an expression of profound interest as she made her way down the aisle. "Miss Williams," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of conversations, "I believe we need to talk." The room fell silent again, but this time the silence hummed with possibility rather than tension. Maya felt something shift in her chest, like a door opening to a room she'd never seen before. Everything had changed. Everything. The transformation was immediate and profound. As students filed out of the lecture hall, They no longer walked past Maya as if she were invisible. Instead, they approached her with something that looked remarkably like reverence. Sarah Kim, a sophomore who had never spoken to Maya before, was the first to reach her. "That was absolutely incredible," Sarah said, her eyes bright with genuine admiration. "I've been studying piano for 12 years, and I've never heard anyone play with that kind of emotion. How did you learn to interpret Chopin like that?" More students gathered around, their earlier indifference replaced by curiosity and respect. Even James Wellington, who had been whispering mockingly just an hour before, hung back at the edge of the group, clearly wanting to approach, but unsure how to navigate this complete reversal of social dynamics. Catherine Morrison had disappeared entirely, slipping out a side door the moment the applause had died down. "Miss Williams," Dr. Lane's voice cut through the chatter of students. The academy director approached with the measured pace of someone used to making decisions that changed lives. "Would you join me in my office? There are some things we should discuss." Maya nodded, still feeling as if she were floating slightly above the ground. As she gathered her notebook and pen, Professor Thornfield appeared beside her. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by something that might have been humility. "Miss Williams," he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your abilities that were unfounded. Your performance today was exceptional by any standard." Maya looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the intimidating professor who had tried to humiliate her, but a man who had just had his worldview challenged and found it lacking. "Thank you, Professor," she said simply. "I hope this helps you see other students differently, too." Thornfield nodded slowly. "It will. I promise you that." The walk to Dr. Lane's office felt like a parade. Students and faculty members they passed stopped their conversations to watch Maya go by, many offering congratulations or simply nodding with newfound respect. Word of her performance was already spreading through the building like wildfire. Dr. Lane's office was everything Maya had imagined an academy director's office would be. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with musical scores and academic texts. A baby grand piano sat in one corner, and framed photographs showed Dr. Lane with famous musicians from around the world. "Please, sit," Dr. Lane said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I want to discuss your future here at Berkeley." Maya's heart hammered as she settled into the chair. "My future?" "Your performance today was extraordinary. Not just technically proficient, but musically mature in ways that most students don't achieve until their graduate work, if ever." Dr. Lane leaned forward, her expression serious but kind. "I'm prepared to offer you a full scholarship for the remainder of your time here." The words hit Maya like a physical force. She gripped the arms of her chair, afraid she might fall out of it. "A full scholarship?" "Complete tuition coverage plus a monthly stipend for living expenses. You shouldn't have to work 25 hours a week serving coffee when you could be dedicating that time to your music." Dr. Lane pulled a folder from her desk drawer. "But that's not all. I've been in contact with the Carnegie Hall Education Program. They're looking for exceptional young musicians for their Emerging Artist Series. Based on what I heard today, I'd like to recommend you." Maya felt tears starting to build behind her eyes. "Carnegie Hall?" It would be a debut recital in their smaller venue, but it's still Carnegie Hall, the kind of opportunity that launches careers. Dr. Lane smiled. "Your story is remarkable, Maya. Self-taught, working multiple jobs, overcoming financial hardship to pursue your passion. That's exactly the kind of narrative that inspires people." As Maya walked back toward her dorm that evening, her phone buzzed with a text from her grandmother. "How did your big class go, baby girl?" Maya found herself laughing through tears as she hit the call button. "Grandma Rose? You're not going to believe what happened today?" "Try me, honey. I believe in miracles." Maya told her everything, from Thornfield's cruel challenge to the standing ovation to the meeting with Dr. Lane. By the end of the story, she could hear her grandmother crying on the other end of the line. "I knew it," Rose whispered through her tears. "I knew the world would see what I've always seen. You got something special, baby girl. Something that can't be taught and can't be bought." "I want to do something with this opportunity, Grandma. I want to help other kids like me. Kids who think their dreams are too big for their circumstances." "You will, honey. You will. But first, you just enjoy this moment. You earned it." That night, Maya sat in the dormitory's common area at the old upright piano where she'd practiced countless late-night sessions. But instead of running through technical exercises or struggling with difficult passages, she simply played. Students gathered around to listen, drawn by the same magnetic quality that had captivated the lecture hall earlier that day. But this time, there was no pressure, no judgment, no fear of failure. There was only music, pure and honest and true. Maya played until her fingers ached, pouring out gratitude and joy and hope for a future that suddenly seemed limitless. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new dreams to chase. But tonight, she had proven something that would stay with her forever. Talent doesn't need permission to shine. 6 months later, Maya Williams stood on the stage of Carnegie Hall's Zankel Hall, her hands poised above the keys of a concert grand piano. The audience fell silent as she began to play the same piece that had changed her life, Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor. But this time, she played it as herself. Not as the scholarship student trying to prove she belonged, not as the girl from South End fighting against assumptions, but as Maya Williams, pianist. The music flowed from her fingers with the confidence of someone who had learned the most important lesson of all: authentic talent cannot be diminished by circumstances. In the audience, Grandma Rose sat in the front row, wearing her best dress and crying tears of pure joy. Professor Thornfield was there too, having driven down from Boston specifically to hear her play. His presence was no longer intimidating, but supportive. The presence of a teacher who had learned as much from his student as she had from him. Maya's story became a symbol for something larger than one moment of triumph in a lecture hall. It became proof that excellence isn't determined by zip codes or bank accounts, that passion can overcome prejudice, and that sometimes the most powerful response to those who underestimate you is simply to show them who you really are. The young woman who had once served coffee to pay for the privilege of learning music now served as an inspiration to countless others facing their own moments of doubt and discrimination. She established a scholarship fund for underprivileged music students, ensuring that financial barriers would never again silence voices that deserve to be heard. Professor Thornfield reformed his teaching methods, approaching each new student with curiosity rather than assumptions. The lecture hall where Maya had faced her greatest challenge became a place where talent was nurtured regardless of its origin story. But perhaps the most important change was invisible, carried in the hearts of everyone who witnessed that remarkable afternoon. They learned that when we make space for excellence in all its forms, when we listen without prejudice and judge without bias, we open ourselves to moments of transcendent beauty that would otherwise be lost forever. Maya's fingers found their way to those final chords, the same chords that had once hung in the air of a lecture hall like a challenge answered. This time, they rang out with the authority of a dream fulfilled and a future unlimited. Have you ever been in a situation where someone underestimated your potential? Where does your background or circumstances make others assume you couldn't achieve something extraordinary? Maya's story reminds us that our greatest victories often come not from meeting others' expectations, but from exceeding our own. If this story moved you, subscribe to see more incredible journeys of underdogs who refused to accept limitations. Next week, we'll share the story of a street food vendor who challenged a celebrity chef's assumptions about real cuisine, and the shocking results that followed. This is part of our Underdog Victories series, where ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things simply by refusing to let others define their limits. Because sometimes, The most powerful revolution is simply believing in yourself. Hit that subscribe to Black Voice's Uncut button and ring the notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens when passion meets opportunity and changes everything.
At Black Voices Uncut, we don't polish away the pain or water down the message. We tell it like it is because the truth deserves nothing less. If today's story spoke to you, click like, join the conversation in the comments, and subscribe so you'll be here for the next Uncut Voice.